back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston. If this is your first time here, this is a YouTube channel where we do gear demos and reviews, as well as studio tips and tricks for leveling up your writing, playing, and production from a guitar player working out of a studio. If that's the kind of thing that would appeal to you, please hit that subscribe button and stick around for future videos. And today, we're taking a look at the all-new Continua from AC Noises. We've covered a handful of AC Noises pedals on the channel over the years, the most recent of which being a really great stereo ambient pedal last year. And AC Noises is back with what I would probably say is their most ambitious release to date. This is Continua, and it is a stereo dynamic sampler. And what we mean by that is it's part real-time sampler, part granular effect, and part all-in-one ambient and lo-fi workflow. Let me explain what I mean by that. It's a stereo dynamic sampler, and what that means is it listens to your incoming playing and grabs samples of that playing to play back in basically a delay in stereo. The repeats can bounce left to right, and as you continue to play, that audio will be replaced with new incoming audio and kind of work its way through following your playing. And the workflow for that is really simple. You have mix, you have tempo, which can be used as a time knob fluidly or in conjunction with a tap tempo mode to kind of subdivide the tap tempo as you play. Next to that, you have pitch and sustain. Sustain is going to be how long the audio in the buffer currently, and pitch is from noon either going to blend in octave down and octave down plus a fifth, or octave up plus octave up and a fifth. And you can think of that as basically the broad shape of the sampler itself. There's a little bit more that could be done there, but that's all in secondaries that we will address in our sound samples. Below that, you have the true kind of beating heart movement center of Continua. You have a glitch or dimensions control, a lo-fi or crush control, a reverb or smear control, and a low pass / high pass filter. And what all these knobs are going to do, as you would expect, is apply a kind of glitch or dimensionality to those sampled repeats, giving you access to random time imperfections, speed ups and slowdowns, or the ability to kind of layer recently cleared buffer moments on top of the existing buffer, the ability to apply either a lo-fi warbling modulation or bit crushing, the ability to process that delay repeat sample through either a big reverb or through a kind of smearing effect that will kind of scatter those delays out, and instead of turning them into a big ambient piece, will instead make them feel a lot more granular. And then, of course, as you would expect, low pass, high pass. Very, very helpful for high passing some of the junk in lo-fi or low passing out some of the harshness and fizziness of a bit crusher. And all those parameters have labeled secondary controls underneath them. Mix has an input effects blend, we'll get to that. Tempo has sensibility, which coincides with the threshold secondary under glitch and dimension. That's going to be the point at which the pedal looks for audio to sample and in turn decides whether or not to sample it. You have an attack and release set of controls, basically determining how quickly the sampled audio rises and falls in volume as it is processed through the buffer. And then you have a modulation control for your lo-fi and bit crusher engines. You have a decay control for the reverb and smearing effects, and you have a stereo spread control determining how wide all the stereo effects in this thing are meant to be. But my favorite thing about this pedal is not just the kind of Build-A-Bear workshop approach to granular delay here, the fact that you can take a very simple dynamic sampler and start to imbue it with whatever specific flavors of granular and ambient you want to using this workflow. But it's that down here you have this tap tempo control on the left side, and you can tap tempo it in, or you can set it to the center point, press this, and it triggers basically an auxiliary workflow. And what that means is now your dry signal, not just the sampled signal, passes through all of those effect parameters along the bottom, meaning you can imbue your wet and dry signals with that big crush or that lo-fi into that reverb and into that high and low pass filter. And in that context, you can also take the sampler mix to 0 and just use this as a kind of all-in-one lo-fi workflow for your dry guitar. And there's so much going on here that I haven't even gotten to the fact that opposite that alt control is a standard, reverse, and tail mode. And what that is in that lo-fi sampler, you can either have those delay repeats play back forward, playback backwards, or in that tail mode, it will basically carve off the attack transient and the decay of each of those notes, giving you access to a really smooth, gentle ambient version of that granular delay effect. There is a lot going on here. There's also mono in, stereo in, as well as a preset mode, MIDI in and out on the side, and a USB-C jack. That's a lot of information. I think the important question is, how does it sound? I think great, but I also think it's important that you hear it. So let's get into our sound samples and give Continua a listen. So as always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we're working in. I am playing my Fender Eric Johnson Strat with Lawler pickups into the mono input of the Continua. We are running out of the stereo outs directly into our DAW, which is using the high Z inputs on the Apollo 8 XP interface, and we are using Archetype John Mayer. This is what our dry tone sounds like. So I would love to be able to kind of go top to bottom on the control scheme here, but I think the actual most efficient way to kind of go through this process is going to be to start with the top row of controls, then this right switch right here, then the secondary row of controls, then the labeled alternate controls, and then these other controls here at the very end. So let's go ahead and dive in. And I think, like I said earlier in the video, I think the value of the Continua here is that it starts incredibly simple and is kind of a choose your own adventure of granular wet effects and time-based effects. So this is knobs at noon, everything about as clean and straightforward as it's going to get the Continua. So you are getting, at your core, a really simple kind of 2 on each side ping-ponging delay kind of thing right there, with stereo widening available and all that stuff. Across the top, we have our mix control. Up to full wet. And then you have subdivisions for your tap tempo. So this is in tap tempo mode right now. And you can subdivide down or up. Or chop up into smaller subdivisions. To the right of that is where you really start to get from kind of standard delay stuff into something a little bit more identifiable as that kind of granular thing. With your pitch control here, as you kind of go counterclockwise, you start to blend in an octave down and then a fifth below that. And north of noon, octave up and a fifth above that. And after that, you have your repeats. Full on the repeats spectrum, you get a freeze mode. It is worth noting that that locks off new content going into, new audio going into the buffer. So if you hit freeze with nothing in it already, then you're out of luck. You're not going to get anything. But you can take it back a bit, lock it into place, and then play with it from there. So at the top, pretty straightforward. Mix, subdivisions, octaves and fifths, repeats. Now, we're going to jump to right here because you have this kind of basic structure of your delay buffer. And down here, it gives you access to the way we've been using it so far, which is standard forward-facing repeats, or the ability to put them in reverse. Or what's really cool, this tail mode, which basically cuts off the start of every kind of sample coming in and gives you these really ghostly kind of sine waved versions of your notes. So let's go ahead and go to full wet so you can hear each of these in isolation. You can treat this third mode something close to an auto swell, where if you kind of like slide two notes together and don't let the envelope close after the first one, you'll get that kind of transient pick attack caught in the open gate. But if you take notes, and give a little bit of space between each one will open smoothly and close back up again. But if you kind of go and don't give it time to reclose, you'll get that transient attack in the trail kind of being left open. Let's go ahead and jump back over to standard and give a listen to kind of the primary controls along the bottom right here, because this is where the pedal really starts to get compelling, in my opinion. And as we go through this section, we will play with those octaves and the time controls and the reverse to kind of embellish, because yeah, we don't want to just hear everything by itself. We want to start building upon the core sound and create something cool. So as you've heard so far, the buffer just holds on to the most recent thing I have played. So if I play a G, it'll only play that for however long this is set for, or until I give it something new in the buffer. So G to E. But you can actually create something less sample-based and more delay-based by going clockwise on this far left control right here. If you go into the dimensions, it starts stacking different samples that have already been captured. So we can now go. So let's try something simpler there. Let's go ahead and slow our tempo down and go to like a slow subdivision and just kind of create some stuttery, glitchy chord changes. Going the other direction from noon there, you have the ability to get into the glitch mode, which is going to randomly respeed your delay. So let's go back to noon, go back to a kind of standard sound. We're at noon on that too. And now you've got both sides offer up a very different kind of expression in terms of glitchy weirdness, one being more time-based and one being more the ability to kind of recall something recently cleared from the buffer, or so you thought. Next up, let's go ahead and introduce some texture to what we're doing. We're going to leave that dimension up a little bit. We've got everything else kind of at noon, more or less. And this is going to introduce either a lo-fi counterclockwise or a bit crush clockwise, which we actually will immediately use with the high pass, low pass on the far right for obvious reasons. Or clockwise, we start to kind of reduce the sample rate. And so you can hear now we are getting into some space where you are stacking these different ideas together, those octaves, the ability to kind of layer in some different samples in the buffer, as well as the ability to kind of like lo-fi or bit crush or whatever you need to do. And then probably the most important part of this process as you kind of build this sound, let's go ahead and take everything back to basically normal. You then can use this control right here to either smear or reverberate. And so basically to the left is just a reverb. And to the right is a kind of smear that takes those buffered repeat sections and kind of spreads them out and creates something a little bit more identifiable as granular. So let's go ahead, take that back to noon, give ourselves some of that dimension, some of that lo-fi, and then start playing with that to kind of really contextualize this as a granular device. Before we get into our secondary controls, let's go ahead and take a look at this switch right here. We've had it in tap mode so far, which allows us to obviously tap in our tempo, which is then what kind of sets this control right here. But you can go to a middle position here that is basically called alts. And you might think that that's alternate functions, but you would be incorrect. This is the alternate signal routing, which basically allows not only the delay repeats, the kind of like input buffer to route through all of these kind of parameters, but also routes your input dry signal through the parameters as well. So if we go ahead and set ourselves to like a lo-fi, slightly reverberant sound right here, and take our mix nice and low, and press this button, we can even take our repeats entirely out of the equation and use this just as like a lo-fi modulator. You will notice that right now, if we take that filter all the way, you're still hearing dry guitar. And that is because by default, there is a 50-50 blend of your dry signal and the wet signal that gets processed through all of these parameters. But you can also make an adjustment with that with the secondary controls. So let's go ahead and yeah, you've got... Okay, let's disengage that and let's get into these secondary parameters. There are secondaries on both the top and the bottom layers. So we'll start with this top layer right here. To access your secondary controls, you just tap both buttons at the same time, and it will give you access to the kind of alternate routing effects mix. So earlier we talked about this aux control allowing you to apply a bunch of the effect parameters to your dry signal as well as the repeats. And this is going to control how much of your dry signal still persists when you have that engaged. Let's go ahead and take it up to 100%. It is by default 50%, which was why when we were using that filter on the dry tone, we were still getting our dry signal kind of passing through. Now we will get kind of fully lo-fi or bit crushed moments with our guitar. Next up, we have what is called the sensibility control, which can basically be read as sensitivity. It's the amount of volume required to re-trigger a new input buffer state for the Continua. Basically how loudly you have to play for Continua to add new information, add new audio to the input buffer of that delay and clear out the old one. And then you have attack and release, which is going to be how quickly audio kind of swells up and how quickly it fades away relative to the kind of decay control by default on here. By default, this is immediate, so 0% for attack, so very quick onset, and about 60% release. Let's go ahead and take release all the way up for a more gentle experience. And let's also just kind of bring in our attack a little bit more. Having made a couple of these changes, let's go ahead and tap both buttons, get back to our standard operation. You can hear a slower onset of notes coming in and more of a gentle release of those notes as they fade out. And of course, we can go over here, and if we access that auxiliary program, and in this context, we can also take our repeats completely out and just use this as a like fully effective real-time modulator. Okay, let's go ahead and move down to this second row of secondary modifiers, making use of some of these sounds that we already have. We're going to turn aux back off, but we're going to kind of set everything to be broadly useful here. We're going to have some of that lo-fi modulation engaged. We'll take that filter out for now, and we'll leave in some of that reverb. Let's go ahead and enter into our secondary control parameter again. And from here, we have access to a threshold control, modulation, decay, and a stereo spread. Modulation is going to be only applied when either the crush or the lo-fi is active, which is why we have it set up to kind of like run right now. You can take this down to minimum, and it will be no modulation applied to that lo-fi, so just kind of signal degradation, no warble. And as you turn it up, you get that kind of like pitch bend. Next to that, you have your decay, which is not going to be the same as the decay on the kind of modulated granular delay repeats, but instead the decay for the reverb. So let's leave it at like a nice medium long. This is threshold, kind of like with the sensibility control up top. This is not the resampling control. This is the amount needed to kind of start sampling in the first place in case you want to be able to kind of play softly without getting any repeats and then dig in a little bit harder to start to kind of get your granular repeats going. And finally, you have your stereo spread control right here. By default, it's about 40%. But you can take it to minimum to collapse it to mono. Offer just a tiny bit of width if that's all you want. Or max it out and get really hard left-right repeats. That really hard panned thing can be cool too, because as you kind of crank that modulation, play with that reverb decay, you can go ahead and let's max out that wet control. When you want to go into that lo-fi modulation mode, you can control how wide you want that stereo image of your lo-fi guitar to be. So at minimum, we're getting or we can widen that guitar all the way out.